this series of lectures, we've talked about the growing power of wearables. We've looked at how, over the last decade, advancements in sensor technology, data analytics, and connectivity have enabled devices like smartwatches, fitness trackers, and health monitors to become an integral part of many people's lives, counting your steps, quantifying your sleep, measuring the rhythms of your heart, and giving you personalized training recommendations based on your fitness level. And over the coming years, consumer wearables will likely be able to provide real-time health diagnostics based on things like your blood pressure and blood glucose. They'll be able to detect the early signs of disease and offer personalized recommendations, not just for your training program, but also your overall health. In short, your device will have a pretty detailed picture of your behaviors, your habits, your lifestyle, and your health. It'll know when you're sleeping, when you're socializing, when you're sick. It'll be able to predict potential health risks based on your past behaviors. It'll be able to forecast your likelihood of developing diabetes or heart disease based on your activity levels or vital signs. That's some pretty sensitive data. It's the kind of data that could be incredibly powerful. So for example, it could be a boon to public health, enabling large-scale monitoring of health trends and early detection of disease outbreaks across a population. It could enable remote healthcare monitoring, allowing doctors to keep an eye on patients with chronic conditions without needing them to visit the hospital. It could be used to incentivize people towards better behaviors, like increasing their physical activity by providing rewards for meeting fitness goals. But this data could also be used against you. It could be used to risk profile you, leading to increased insurance premiums if your lifestyle is associated with higher health risks. It could screen you out of certain job prospects if employers gain access to data indicating potential health or productivity issues. It could be a factor in determining whether you get a loan or a mortgage, and it could even be used for identity theft if hackers manage to intercept or steal your data. When you use a wearable device, how you share your data and with whom should be foremost in your mind. Even though there are regulatory and legislative protections in place to safeguard consumers, the nature of the commercial ecosystem and consumer choice means that it's still possible for your data to fall into the wrong hands. There are loopholes and gaps, often specific to the device or the location in which it is used, that companies can take advantage of. All of this makes using wearables for healthcare and public health research tricky. So in this lecture, we'll unpack some of these issues and talk about some of the things you as a researcher or healthcare professional should consider when using wearables in practice. In the old days, or since the early 2000s, when wearable technologies were being used for research, the data that was being gathered was in a kind of closed-off ecosystem. So it was captured by the participant and relayed to the researcher with no third-party involvement. Things like pedometers and accelerometers were used in public health and biomechanics research to monitor and improve physical activity in participants. These wearables were dumb. They weren't connected to the internet and relied on openly accessible algorithms that had been validated against an appropriate criterion measure and supported by peer-reviewed work. The whole process was simple, and this made ethical oversight relatively simple too. You had a data controller, the researcher, a data processor, also the researcher, and a data subject, the participant. The study protocol and participant information leaflet would have been reviewed and approved by an institutional ethics board before data collection started, and only data that was explicitly required to fulfill the stated aims of the research would be captured, nothing more. Things are different now though. Consumer devices have proliferated. They're cheap, they're widely available. They have engaging UIs and they're online, and this embeds the wearable device manufacturer in the research process. The minute the participant is given a device, in order for them to be able to use it to collect data, they inevitably have to accept the device manufacturer's privacy policy in terms of use. Ultimately, this means that both the researcher and the participant are at the mercy of the company's data policies. And this is a challenge because the amount and the kinds of data collected and what that data is used for is suddenly outside of their control. You see, unlike researchers, companies tend to be motivated to collect as much information as they can, and their data collection practices, which are outlined in those privacy policy documents, are wordy and complex, so people end up not reading them. The main concern in a research context is that the participant's personal information will often get stored and analysed by third parties using black box algorithms, the inner workings of which are often unknown to the researchers and sometimes even the company. These algorithms can also be changed on a whim, and this undermines the robustness or validity of a research trial. Envisage the following scenario. You're a researcher tracking daily step counts in a group of participants using a wrist-worn fitness tracker. You're in the middle of the protocol. You have a group of participants actively collecting data for you, when all of a sudden the manufacturer changes their step count algorithm, and now all the data you've collected up to that point is different to the data that's coming in now. The pre and post data from the algorithmic change can't be pooled, and you can't access the raw data that was fed into the algorithm in the first place. And this is just one of the challenges when using consumer devices for research. Another is how that data is managed and stored after it's collected. You as a researcher might have asked your participants to upload their device data to a secure platform, or you might have created your own app which plugs into the device manufacturer's API to fetch the data. But the data is still in those companies' ecosystems, and what they decide to do with it is often outside of your control. The companies could decide to sell the data to analytics and marketing firms. Essentially, they become data brokers, acquiring, merging, analyzing, and sharing data with lots of different groups. Your data could also be used to train the company's AI models to better predict, influence, and adapt to the user, your research participant, or a patient, or a parent, or a student, or something else. When we think about those black box algorithms I mentioned before and how they are opaque and difficult to explain, when these are built on datasets that are not necessarily representative of the wider population, this can result in the algorithms replicating human bias and prejudice, making discriminatory conclusions based on sensitive health data or inaccurate data. Sure, sometimes companies give you the option to opt out of these services, but not all companies do this, and if they do, it's usually not the default option. Add that to the fact that many companies incorporate behavioral change techniques into their apps, and we have a situation where these companies are subtly influencing users' decisions and behaviors in ways that are difficult to quantify. So here's a simple example. Garmin watches, which function as activity, sleep, and stress trackers, suggest training recommendations to the wearer if they fail to meet certain metrics, like activity goals, to ostensibly help improve their health and well-being while tacitly promoting other Garmin services or products. This type of adaptive choice architecture, which uses the participants' own data to influence their behavior, is really problematic in research settings because it's impossible to control experimentally. So what happens when the device manufacturer is deliberately more liberal in their approach to data management? Risk increases. And that's why there have been so many data breaches that have exposed sensitive information from millions of people. One of the most famous examples include a relatively recent security breach where over 61 million fitness tracker records from Apple and Fitbit were exposed online. Another was when Strava released a heat map detailing American military placement around the globe based on the geolocation data they'd acquired from personnel's Fitbits and other fitness trackers. These examples show how, because the data collected from consumer wearables is sent to the company as a function of using the device, we as researchers can do very little to guarantee the safety of our participants' data. This is why there has been such a push to regulate these kinds of technologies. In Europe, the General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR, serves to protect the privacy of individuals by requiring companies to obtain explicit consent before they collect and use personal data. But as I've already alluded to, once the participant accepts the device's privacy policy in terms of use, the company can still gather extensive data. What does this mean for researchers looking to use wearable devices in their research? Well, let's use me as an example, a researcher based in Europe and who therefore has to adhere to GDPR, among other things. So let's say I'm the researcher and I provide my participants with a wearable device, like an Apple Watch, to collect data for a study I'm running. Here, the implications of GDPR are significant for me. Under GDPR, I'm considered the data controller because I determine the purposes and means of processing the data. The wearable device manufacturer, in this example Apple, becomes the data processor because they process the data being captured by the device that I gave to my participant. Their platforms and algorithms count steps, estimate energy expenditure, capture sleep, time, and all of that on my behalf. Here's where things get tricky though. GDPR requires that any data controller, me, who engages a data processor, Apple, must have a data processing agreement, a DPA, in place. This agreement outlines how the processor will handle the data, ensuring it meets GDPR standards for data protection and privacy. In this example, this means I have to negotiate a DPA with Apple, which, as you might expect, isn't really feasible because Apple isn't going to go and tailor their standardized policies and enter individual agreements with researchers like me. But what if my participants already own Apple Watches and are collecting that data anyway? If I, as a researcher, am not actively directing the collection of data and my participant is simply sharing their pre-collected data, then a DPA isn't required. The participant acts as the data controller of their data and consents to share it with me, the researcher. I still have to obtain explicit consent from the participant for using this data. I have to clearly explain what I'm using it for, how it will be stored, and the risks involved. But the process is much easier and I don't have to set up a DPA with Apple. And what if participants are using their own devices to collect data and the research is kind of tacked on to that, whereby there is a kind of opportunistic prospective gathering of data that the participant would be recording anyway? This is a bit of a grey area and I've encountered both points of view. Some say I would need a DPA with Apple and others say not because the data is being gathered anyway. In any case, even though the participant controls the data collection, I'm still responsible for ensuring GDPR compliance, so I'd have to make sure I obtained explicit consent from my participants and ensured that they understand the privacy implications of participating in my research. Now let's take a step back and compare this situation with other regions. In the United States, the main regulation governing health data privacy is the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, or HIPAA. The HIPAA sets standards for protecting sensitive patient information and ensuring data privacy and security, but it primarily applies to entities like healthcare providers, health plans, and healthcare clearinghouses, as well as their business associates. So if you as a researcher are part of a covered entity or working with one, HIPAA's requirements do apply. You have to ensure that personal health information is safeguarded. This includes obtaining appropriate authorizations or consent to use the data and ensuring that the data is protected against unauthorized access. But otherwise, you might be outside of its jurisdiction. You see, consumer wearables like Apple Watches or Fitbits often fall outside HIPAA's scope because they're not necessarily used in a clinical setting. Instead, the data is governed by the device manufacturer's privacy policies. And as we've already discussed, these can vary widely in their rigor and transparency. Another important piece of legislation is the California Consumer Privacy Act, or CCPA, which provides an additional level of protection for residents of this state. The CCPA grants individuals the right to know what personal data is being collected about them, the ability to access this data, the right to request deletion of their data, and the right to opt out of the sale of their personal data. So if you're a California-based researcher and you are giving your research participants wearables for the purposes of collecting data for your research, it falls on you to ensure that third parties, in other words, the manufacturer of the wearable device you are using to collect that data, also comply with CCPA requirements. Now, those are just some examples. We obviously can't go through all the different pieces of legislation here, but the core message is that if you as a researcher are planning to prospectively collect data using wearable devices that you give to participants, it's likely that you will need to have a data processing agreement with the company providing the wearables. Ultimately, these regulations, while varying in specifics, share common principles. The need for explicit consent, transparency in data handling, and robust security measures are all at the forefront, and researchers have to navigate those regulations carefully, ensuring compliance while maintaining the integrity of their studies. So as technological progress continues its advance, the reach of various companies, and this is not specific to wearable device manufacturers, will only increase. What began as basic software with our technologies, Walkmans, Game Boys, PCs, Macs, iPhones, and now wearable devices, has evolved into a social tool that shapes our lives, often in pernicious ways. Big tech companies, the devices they manufacture and the code that they write, create black box algorithms that can be as consequential to us as the decisions of politicians and judges. They write the algorithms that regulate our perceptions of reality, how fit we are relative to our peers, how well we slept, our body battery, our risk of mortality, all while sharing these data, often without our full and informed consent. People might choose to use a particular wearable device, but that economic approval should not grant tech companies the authority to assume a deterministic role in a person's life course. So these new digital technologies might indeed become the healthcare panacea they are often touted as, but they also grant the institutions that own and control them, and the individuals who write the code, enormous power over others. With the world of technology dominated by a handful of highly successful large companies, this power is increasingly concentrated in the hands of a few. There is a dystopian version to the panacea of networked healthcare then, where data misuse and privacy breaches become the norm rather than the exception. So as researchers and healthcare professionals and informed citizens, it's our responsibility to navigate this complex landscape with vigilance. We have to advocate for stronger regulations, demand greater transparency, and ensure that ethical standards are upheld in the use of these technologies. By doing so, we can harness the potential of wearables to improve health and well-being while safeguarding the privacy and autonomy of individuals.